Hello everyone, and welcome back to the basics of Hazard 5. Today we're going to be going over the movement and support tools for every class. I was originally going to do the perk video before this one, but I kind of got sucked into it and really got the ball rolling, so I hope you'll be alright with this one coming out first. Also, I'd like to apologize in advance as there's a little bit of audio-video desync by the end of the video. This only affects the actual weapon terminal segment of the video, not the additional elements that I've added to show off what I'm talking about, so it'll barely be noticeable. You might just notice it a little bit more towards the end of the video when I start talking about mods before I mouse over them. However, I think I do a good enough job with my verbal explanation that, honestly, we could do this with a black screen. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, for the first tier on the Sentry Gun, we can either have 2 turrets with more carried ammo, or we can have 1 turret with a higher ammo capacity, more damage, and slightly longer range. This tier is largely up to personal preference and really only comes down to whether or not you're willing to maintain 2 Sentry Guns or just want to maintain 1. However, regardless of what you pick, you need to make the further choices based upon whether you're running 1 or 2 guns. Personally, I will always run 2 Sentry Guns because it doubles the effective DPS, which brings us into the second tier. You can either have more total ammo in reserves, halved build time for each turret, or allows you to reload the turrets twice as fast. Now the reloading speed on the turrets is really not that inconvenient, and that you can just recall the turrets to you and put them back down to reload them indirectly, and the total ammo addition really isn't that significant, and considering the fact that I'm running 2 turrets, I'm absolutely going to be taking quick build. This will allow you to whip out at least 1 turret whenever you're caught off guard by bugs. In the third tier, there's a couple of interesting choices to be made here. If you're running a single turret, it might be something to consider to run more ammo capacity so that you have to refill it less often. And then you also have stun, which gives each round fired from the Sentry Guns a 20% chance to stun. And you have armor break, which triples the effective armor break. Personally, I find stun most useful for slowing the advances of full hordes, and every now and then you can also get a lucky stun on something like a Praetorian. And which brings us to the last tier, which unfortunately there isn't really a significant choice to be made in right now, as Defender System massively increases the damage done by your guns. However, the alternative is Hawkeye Systems, which nearly doubles the effective range and allows you to ping specific targets for your turrets to shoot. However, the significant damage boost offered by Defender is really not something that can be argued with. So disregarding the third tier, we'll go ahead and go over some of the numbers for the different turret setups. Running Gemini with Quick Build and Defender System will give you 5,665 total damage at 11 damage per shot. If you were to run this same build with a Mark II turret, you would only have 5,525 total damage, but you do 13 damage per shot. But keep in mind, there's half as many guns shooting when you only have a Mark II turret. Now if we switch over to the expanded ammo bags mod, meaning that we reduce the build time of every turret, which I would consider taking if you're running a Mark II turret and only have to set up 1 very often. However, I don't think I'd ever run this with Gemini. So if you have a Mark II turret with slow build, you'll have a total damage of 6,695 at 13 damage per shot. And if you do run this with Gemini, despite the extreme build time, you'll be able to do 6,655 total damage at 11 damage per shot. So in conclusion, the best balance between DPS and total damage on paper is Gemini with ammo and Defender System. However, it's going to take you 8 full seconds to set up your turrets, assuming that you do it perfectly. So for me, I'd go ahead and run Gemini with Quick Deploy. Because at least in my experience, the extra damage that you'll get from having all that extra ammo really isn't worth how many times you're going to get overwhelmed trying to set up your turrets. There's something to be said for running slow build turrets on defensive objectives like salvage or escort, but even then, I still think it's worth having flexible turrets that you can deploy at a moment's notice. So for that reason, this is what I would run with Gemini turrets, and this is what I would run with a Mark II turret. Next we have the Platform Gun. Not a whole lot of choices on the Platform Gun, unfortunately, but we'll go ahead and go through everything regardless. In the first tier, we have increased fire rate, which doubles the rate of fire that you can shoot platforms, which is unfortunately made irrelevant by tap canceling the recoil of the Platform Gun. There's more information about all the nuances of the Platform Gun in my Engineer class guide. I'll go ahead and leave a link to that down below. I have a whole section in that video about platforming and how to kind of speed it up, which really makes both the fire rate modification and the magazine modification much less powerful, as you can bypass them with good gameplay technique. So for that reason, we're going to take the extra ammo in the first tier. In the second tier, we have Plascrete Mark II. Very simply, reduces the fall damage that you take when you fall onto your platforms. In the third tier, we have an additional 8 ammo, the same value as the mod in the first tier, repellent additive, and Disabled Inertia Inhibitor. Disabled Inertia Inhibitor is a very bizarre modification. It also exists on the PGL, which essentially means that whenever you're moving, your projectiles will inherit your momentum. So if you're strafing to the right and you fire a platform, it will drift to the right in flight. Personally, I think this is nothing but a detriment to your playstyle. I understand that it can be useful with RJ250 compound on the PGL, but I have no idea what it's supposed to do for the platform gun, in that really, if your projectiles aren't going where your crosshair is at the time that you fire them, I don't think anything else could possibly be a benefit. So for that reason, it's kind of between repellent and extra ammo. If you like to play a highly mobile engineer playstyle, climbing up the walls and platform parkouring your way around, I usually take the expanded ammo bags for that reason. However, there is something very significant to be said for the defensive capabilities of repellent additive. Personally, I don't think it's necessary for setting up very solid defensive positions. If you're not aware of how repellent works, it essentially makes the bugs pathfinding think that the platform is twice as large as it is. So for this reason, they'll try to take the shorter route, which will be to go around it. However, if the shortest route to you is over the platform, considering that it is twice as long in their mind, they will still go directly over it. I'll admit that if I had taken more time to really feel out what the perfect distances are for repellent, I'd probably be a little bit more warm to it, but in my personal experience, it's just not worth wrestling with repellent, and I just prefer to have the extra platforms. But I highly encourage you to try out repellent for yourself and get a feel for it, because there's plenty of extremely high-skilled engineers that do enjoy using repellent. Moving on to the shield generator. Unfortunately, there's even less to be said about this than the engineer's platform gun, but we'll go and go over it now. You can have a faster recharge time, or a larger area covered by the shield. There's a lot of mods for this piece of equipment that are the same, but just with different values. So it's important to look at the exact numbers. For example, the size increase in tier 1 is actually less than the size increase in tier 3 by 0.2. Personally, I take the size increase in the first tier so that I don't have to take it later on, because if you keep the minimum size shield, it gets a little cramped and bugs can kind of reach through the sides and hit you and hamper your shield regeneration if the shield is about to go down. In the second tier, we have a recharge mod that's twice as strong as the one in the first tier. However, I still prefer to take the increased duration, as it gives you more time to reset, revive people, get resupplies, and break back out of your shield once it's over. And in the final tier, like we mentioned before, we have an additional radius increase, lasting effect, and even more duration. The lasting effect, in my opinion, is not very strong at all. It only lasts for about 2.5 seconds after you leave this shield. So while it isn't a horrible mod, I think there's something much better you can go with. And since I take the radius higher up, I'm going to go ahead and skip that on the last tier as well, and just take more uptime. Like I mentioned before, this gives you more time to get revives, resupplies, shoot off some bugs, and then leave the shield. I've tinkered with this a few times throughout all my playtime, and really nothing has felt too incredibly significant. The only thing that I would say is mission specific or really impactful is switching over to the second radius mod for Doretta missions so that you can fully shield her. Other than that though, I always run this spec right here on every mission. The Zipline Launcher. Personally, I don't think there's a lot you can do with it to make it too interesting, but there is one very big hidden mechanic that not a lot of people are aware of. So in the first tier, we have an extra zipline, bringing the total to 5, which isn't well shown on this card, as there is one loaded into the magazine that isn't considered by max ammo. So without this modification, you have 4 ziplines because one is already loaded, and with this modification, you'll have 5. Personally, I find it hard to even find places to use ziplines in a mission, so having 5 has never done much for me. Then you have upgraded connection joint, which lets you shoot it higher into the air. This upgrade is actually inaccurate, and so is the base stats, as it's actually 2 points higher than it shows on the card, and that you can shoot ziplines at a 40-degree angle. I'm not sure why exactly that is, but just know that the base angle is 34, and the upgraded angle is 40. This is what I use personally, but an honorable mention would be the increased distance, taking it up to 40. Once again, I struggle to find places to even use ziplines in missions, and the places that I do deem them appropriate are rarely ever even wide enough to justify taking the increased range. This is compounded by the fact that the next tier makes us take range for free, giving us 40-meter ziplines. And in the final tier, we have disconnection protection and increased motor traction. Now out of these two, falling off of a zipline doesn't seem to be such a frequent occurrence, so not something that I would personally take, and considering how painful it is to traverse zip lines, I would probably take the movement speed. However, as it's recently come to my attention, the way the fall damage reduction works on the zipline is calculated in a very odd way, meaning that once you touch a zipline, until you fall to your death, you take reduced fall damage. So with that in mind, we're going to take disconnection protection, because essentially what this turns your zipline gun into is a buff that your teammates can pick up. By launching a zipline early on in the mission, all of your teammates can touch it as they go by, and simply take less fall damage for the rest of the mission or until they fall to their death. And at that point, you can just deploy another zipline for them. They can touch it, or they can go back to the old one if it's a stationary mission like point extraction or refinery. So for this reason, I consider that much more valuable than the slight extra movement speed that you get on ziplines, especially since you can jump on ziplines as the host to increase your movement speed. Now this is a little bit selfish considering this mod affects other players in your game as well. I think they'll thank you for the fall damage protection a little bit more than the extra zipline movement speed. The flare gun. So this tool's a little bit odd in the way that its upgrades works, so we're going to have to look at it as more of a full picture rather than individual tiers. So much like other equipment in the game, we see that it shares some modifications. Right now let's look at the first and the third tier. The first tier has an ammo mod giving you 3 extra flares, and an upgrade to duration which gives you 15 extra seconds. In the third tier we see the mods are exactly the same. 3 extra ammo, and 15 extra seconds. So essentially we can look at the first and third tier as exactly the same. Auto reload is present in the third tier, however I really don't find it necessary considering that Born Ready does exist, so if you really want auto reload on your flare gun, it would probably be more impactful to take Born Ready and get that benefit for your weapons as well. So for this reason, let's just ignore auto reload and look at the first and third tier as just being the same ammo and duration mods. Now let's figure out the middle tier before we do anything else. We have increased fire rate, which is largely made irrelevant by the fact that you can do the same platform gun technique on the flare gun in that you cancel the recoil animation and fire a second flare faster. This can be done, in my experience, to mag dump the flare gun at basically the same speed as this rate of fire upgrade. I used this upgrade for a very long time until this was brought to my attention. Additionally, the magazine upgrade allows us to do something very significant. So for that reason, we're going to take that upgrade in this tier, and we'll get more into why in just a moment. So now we just need to figure out the first and third tier. Basically, we're going to figure out how many flares we come out with based on the upgrades we take, the total flare up time, and how it interacts with resupplies. So let's take both ammo mods to start. This will leave us with 22 flares that burn for 75 seconds apiece. This gives us a total time of 1,650 seconds. Every resupply we take will give us another 11 flares for another 825 seconds. If we take maximum duration, however, we come away with 16 flares that burn for 105 seconds. This gives us 1,680 seconds of flares, with each resupply giving us an additional 8 flares that burn for 840 seconds. So that's the second most total uptime. But now let's do a blend. So we take 1 ammo and 1 duration upgrade. Like I talked about, this doesn't really matter which you take. You can take 1 ammo, 1 duration, or 1 duration, 1 ammo. Personally, I use this spec just because it's cleaner to look at. This leaves us with 19 flares that burn for 90 seconds apiece for a total time of 1,710 seconds. So that's the most total burn time we've had up until this point. However, something very significant is occurring here that we haven't seen up until this point. We have an odd number of flares. So whenever we resupply, instead of gaining 8 out of 16 or 11 out of 22 flares like we would have previously, we gain 10 out of 19. This means that there's a rounding error in the favor of the player, which occurs with all magazine-based weapons in the game, but isn't really noticeable aside from a few weapons. This means that every time we resupply, we gain an additional 900 seconds worth of flares. So essentially, every resupply we take gives us an additional flare for free, whereas any other build of this weapon would not receive that bonus flare. This is the only way to have an odd number of flares and get this error to occur in your favor. So for this reason, this is the only spec of the flare gun I would ever take. The only other way I could justify any other build is if you're playing in a speedrun team and you're moving through caves extremely quickly, then potentially having more shorter duration flares could get you slightly further. However, in a team that's running that efficiently, you're going to have more resupplies than you know what to do with, plenty of nitra, and the slightly less flares I don't think will bog you down at all. Just trying to play devil's advocate a little bit. The Grappling Hook. There's a lot to be said about the grappling hook, and a lot of the upgrades are personal preference. So for most things here, I'm just going to be telling you about my experience with the grappling hook and how I like to run it. Whereas something like the flare gun is more cut and dry. So in the first tier, we have increased recharge speed or a longer range. As we're forced to take longer range in the second tier, I prefer to take faster recharge here. In the third tier, we can either have our hook land where we shoot it faster, or we can be retracted through the air 50% faster. I've bounced back and forth between these two modifications for a long time, in that high velocity ejection system can allow you to more quickly hook onto a wall while you're falling, whereas overcharge winch can allow you to slingshot yourself around corners more effectively. Personally, I prefer overcharge winch just because it feels more fun to strafe through the air faster, but really personal preference in this tier. If you find yourself falling to your death while your grapple hasn't connected to a wall very often, definitely consider high velocity ejection system. And in the final tier, we have safety first, momentum, and bypass integrity check. Bypass integrity check is double the cooldown reduction in the first tier, in that it's 1 second instead of 0.5. If you stack these modifications, you can have an extremely fast recharge on your grappling hook. However, that's not what I prefer. Safety first is very strong, gives you a 30% fall damage resistance whenever you release the grappling hook for a few seconds. So basically until you would hit the ground anyways. I think this is a good mod for anyone who finds themselves falling to their death quite often after grappling, but for high level scouts I think you should try to not rely on this. For all of this, I prefer momentum. Much like safety first, it's triggered upon releasing your grappling hook. Whenever you do, you will receive a 3-second increase to your movement speed. This can allow you to keep your momentum up while carrying heavy objects, jumping along, or just anything else you're doing while waiting for your grappling hook to cool down. With this spec that I have, you only have a 0.5 second downtime on this momentum speed bonus. So theoretically, you can weave your grapples into normal combat and keep your movement speed high, as you don't actually have to grapple, you just have to put your grappling hook on cooldown, meaning that you can just aim at a wall, tap left click, and receive the speed bonus. There's something very significant to be said about bypass integrity check and how often it lets you reposition in combat, but I really like the feel of momentum much more. Once again, a lot of personal preference going on here. If you find that you're always out of range, you could potentially take longer cable in tier 1. If you find yourself falling to your death and not being able to land a grapple, high velocity ejection system might be a good idea. And if you want to play slow, you can take something other than momentum. And finally, the drill man. Let's start with satchel charges. These are very interesting. There's a lot going on with them. However, due to the way the mods are set up, you are pigeonholed into a couple of different builds, which I think is a lot of missed potential. In the first tier, we have increased effect radius, which almost doubles the effective area. Note, this isn't the carving area, it's the damage area. Personally, I find myself blowing myself up with this more than anything whenever using this, mainly because I use such small radius satchels for a long time. I can see someone justifying this, however it causes some issues later on. Next we have bigger charge, which makes it simply do more damage, once again, almost 2 times as much. And then we have an ammo modification, giving you 1 extra satchel charge. Personally, I take the ammo here, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Second tier is kill switch, which allows you to pick up your unused satchel charges. Really, more than any other single upgrade tier in the game, I think this is a lot of missed potential, and you could potentially relocate some other mods here and add some additional mods to make this more interesting. I don't understand why this isn't a baseline part of the item. I don't think this needs to be an upgrade at all. But regardless, moving on to the third tier, we have volatile compound and additional satchel charge. Now, volatile compound is different than the other damage mods we talked about so far. Any damage done to your satchel charge will now destroy it, meaning that if you throw it out and your gunner happens to clip it with a bullet, it will blow up in your face instantly. This can also be done by enemy projectiles, so be extremely careful with volatile compound. But now, we go back to ammo rounding. As I talked about on the flare gun, ammo rounds in favor of the player if you have a magazine on the weapon. However, if there is no magazine, and it's just 1 ammo number, like the satchel charges for example, it will round against the player, meaning down. So if we have 3 total ammo on our satchel charges, we'll only receive 1 per resupply. Meaning that if you take one of the ammo modifications, you're only receiving 1 extra satchel charge per mission, rather than a resupply. So if you take one ammo modification, you are pigeonholed into taking another one, otherwise the first ammo modification is much less valuable than otherwise would be. So for this reason, I take 2 ammo modifications, which gives me 4 satchels and 2 per resupply. In the last tier, we have Big Bang, which does fear in a massive radius around the Satchel Charge, twice its total size if you take none of the upgrades. And we have Concussive Blast, which does stun in the same radius. Personally, if I was to take one of these, I would take Stun just because it keeps the bugs in place, which is more consistent and allows you to get more damage in. And then we have Rock Mover, massively increasing the satchel's carving diameter, almost triple the base value. Personally, this is what I use, since the base damage on satchels is good enough to deal with medium health targets, and since I'm not taking any of the damage upgrades, I have so many satchels, I prefer to use them for terraforming, mining massive veins or multiple veins in the same place, or just cleaning up a zone before a fight. Now this is how I run satchel charges, but there is a much different way to do it. If you want to be extremely greedy with damage, you can take Bigger Charge and Volatile Compound, and then one of the 2 damage mods like Stun or Fear, for example, because at this point you will not be throwing your satchel charges at just rocks. You're going to be using them on bugs, so you want a combat effect. You could also theoretically take Fragmentary Shell with Volatile Compound. Just keep in mind that you're only going to have 2 satchel charges per mission, and only get 1 per resupply. But if there's anything to take away from this is if you take one of the ammo modifications, make sure you take the other one, don't screw yourself over, and also if you're running Volatile Compound, make sure things are safe before you throw that out, because you're going to at least get yourself killed if you try it in a dangerous situation, if not your entire team. And finally we have the drills. In Tier 1, we have Barb Drills, which doubles the damage they do to enemies, Hardened Drill Tips, which lets you drill, in theory, 50% faster, and lets you move faster while mining, and Increased Fuel. The fuel isn't really a lot in this tier, so personally I'd pass it up, so really it's between Hardened Drill Tips and Barb Drills. Now these 2 upgrades have a very interesting competition in this tier. Drilling in the Name of made a much better video and went into much greater detail than I will here. But essentially, what you need to know is Hardened Drill Tips does not make you mine as fast as it says it does. Because at the mining speed that Hardened Drill Tips gives you, you cannot actually keep up with the speed that you're mining at. There is a very strong placebo effect that is done to you by the increased speed of the sound made by the drills when drilling. However, it isn't actually 50% faster. It is still significantly faster, around 30% if I'm not mistaken. So realistically, you want to take Barb Drills if you're running Cryo Cannon to finish off enemies and potentially feed yourself some health with a Vampire perk. But if you're running Flamethrower or Corrosive Sludge Pump, I would probably say go with Hardened Drill Tips even if it's not as good as it's advertised. Personally, I almost always run Cryo Cannon, so I take Barb Drills. In the second tier, Magnetic Refrigeration or Streamlined Integrity Check. Magnetic Refrigeration will cool your drills faster whenever you're not drilling, and Streamlined will cool your drills faster after they overheat. These can seem a little confusing, but at the end of the day, it's just better not to overheat your drills. Because essentially, if you drill when you get to 99% heat, and you let your drills cool down, you can drill again at a short amount of time if you're in an emergency situation. However, even with reduced overheat time, you're still going to be incapable of drilling. So having your drills come back in shorter bursts is much more effective than waiting 5 seconds instead of 8. So for this reason, we're going to take Magnetic Refrigeration. In the third tier, we get a Drill Faster modification with no choice. And in the last tier, we have Increased Ammo or Blood Cooled Drills. Blood Cooled Drills is interesting, however, it doesn't cool your drills faster than simply not drilling. So while it can sustain your drills as a combat weapon, it's not going to be useful for actually intentionally cooling your drills, if that makes sense. So while I do run Barb Drills and run Cryo, it's very, very rare that I find myself having to drill enough frozen enemies to justify taking this modification. If you want to do a challenge run or something where you only use your drills as a weapon, then maybe Blood Cooled Drills could be interesting, but overall, the extra ammo, even though it's not very much, is the way to go. So once again, really the only choice to be made on this weapon is if you're running Cryo, take Barb Drills, and if you're running anything else, take Hardened Drill Tips. Once again, go watch Drilling in the Name of's video on this mod and its interaction with Barb Drills if you want the truth about this modification and how it actually works. But TLDR, it's not unreasonable to take, it's just not as good as it sounds. And that about does it for every movement and support tool in Deep Rock Galactic. This was quite in-depth for something referred to as the basics. So, I hope everyone was able to follow along. Next episode, we'll get on to the perks. After that, we'll start talking about weapons, and then we'll get into some actual gameplay. Before we go, I'd like to take a moment and say thank you for the incredible turnout we've had on the last couple of videos I've made. The last few videos I posted have pretty much completely eclipsed every level of result I've had in the past, so it's good to know that people are enjoying the content and hopefully learning something. But before I get all emotional on you, I'm going to send you on your way. If you want to catch me live, I do stream over on Twitch. If you want to talk to me about support or movement tools, you can find me in my community over on Discord. And as always, thank you for watching, and have a nice day.